Ito, or Mizuko Ito, and I'm a cultural anthropologist of digital youth culture, and I am professor at the University of California, Irvine, and I direct the Connected Learning Lab there. I first became involved in mobile communication research when I was doing my postdoctoral work in Tokyo between 1999 and 2002. And I had actually gone to Japan to study gaming and learning and young people's engagement with new media. But when I got to Japan, it was in the middle of this explosion of mobile phone adoption and Japan's leadership in rolling out things like text messaging, the mobile internet, and camera phones. And what was exciting to me being there at the time was that it was teenage girls who were leading on technology innovation and adoption and developing new ways of using media for communication. And so I decided to not only study gaming culture, which was, dominated by young men, but I also decided to study mobile communications. Yeah, so again, I think that one of the important trends at the time was this interesting gender dynamic where you did have the historically tech-associated young men, doing things with, computers and media culture and games, but then teenage girls in Japan were the ones who were really leading innovation around mobile communication, and that was very interesting to me. So things like text messaging was originally really created by high school girls in Tokyo who appropriated pagers to do text messaging even before the industry officially supported it. And the industry in the late 90s or early to late 90s observed those behaviors and started rolling out the first text messaging systems. And for each new wave of kind of mobile communication, whether it was the mobile internet or camera phones, emoji, young teenage girls were really at the forefront of breaking out new genres for how to communicate new social norms. And it really wasn't until much later that other groups, even young men, business people, and so on, began adopting the kind of mobile communication that we take for granted today. Yeah. So like a lot of other fields that have grown up around new technologies, whether it's digital gaming or internet studies, mobile communication studies was really initially about people coming together and grappling with a new set of technologies that society and culture was, creating new norms, challenging existing ways of doing things. And at the time or at least I didn't have an aspiration to creating a field or anything. I just saw that young people were using these technologies and they were taking over society very, very quickly. And we had people coming from, all over the world because we were seeing mobile phones being adopted in different ways in different parts of the world, across disciplines and across fields to figure out and make sense, develop new methods, develop new conceptual frameworks and vocabularies. And it was exciting to see over the years that field growing in tandem with mobile phones and mobile communication being ubiquitous in society and eventually becoming more formalized, institutionalized, and professionalized. Yeah, compared to the early days, I'm just so impressed at how scholars have really, created professional organizations, conferences, journals in this area. I guess it has been a few decades since, those early days, but during that period, there were just, a single scholar would kind of decide to, do an edited collection like I did, and around the Japan work or, do initially more book-based publications, individual journal articles, one-off conferences and events that were just bringing people together. And we all had, different experiences, different frameworks, different vocabularies, but that moment when people are coming from different fields and disciplines, I always find to be a really generative one because there isn't any existing frameworks that dominate the field. But I think as the field has evolved, as it should, it's become much more specialized, and there are kind of established frameworks that people are building on and a much more robust body of literature. And at the same time, mobile phones are part of so many more aspects of our everyday lives. So the phenomena that we need to study has also diversified. So it's just become much more diversified and specialized in the years since I was first involved. Yeah, I think the contribution that I'm probably the most proud of is having brought Japanese scholarship and an understanding of Japanese society and culture's contribution to mobile communication to the English-speaking world. When I first started doing my postdoctoral work in Japan, it became clear to me that Japanese scholars are always very active in reading English language or other European language scholarship, translating it into Japanese, but the reverse is very rarely the case. So it was a unique opportunity at that time because all of the firsts around Japanese mobile communication, like the mobile internet, camera phones, text messaging, were of great interest to not only technology people and business people, but also scholars. So I thought it would be a good moment to not only do my own research, but highlight the scholarship that has been happening in Japan well before I showed up to do my own research. And so I started connecting with scholars in the field who had been doing it for, since the early 90s when we were seeing these first kind of pager studies and things like that. And, organize some meetings, but also to put together an edited collection and translate their works so that English speakers can read them. And I think the other contribution is really at the intersection of youth culture studies or childhood studies and mobile communication studies. So, my work is sort of engaging with whatever the technologies, the emerging technologies of the day that young people are innovating with and pushing into society, and really understanding some of those power dynamics that happen when young people are innovating and changing social norms, some of the cultural dynamics that adults tend to have when judging and trying to restrict young people's new technology behaviors and cultural forms, and that kind of power dynamic that happens, that is a very kind of well-established set of frameworks within youth studies, was something that I think I helped bring to the mobile communications field. There were many other scholars doing youth adoption as well, but I think as a group of us, those of us who were doing youth culture studies, were bringing a unique framework. So I guess those two things, like kind of an understanding of cultural differences and how that impacts the evolution of technology, and then the specific contributions that youth have made to the field as well. I think mobile communications it has a broader and wider impact than it did when I was doing the work, especially in those early years when, I was studying Japanese teens text messaging, for example, and US teens weren't texting. It only until 10 years later. So I think just to keep in perspective that it has been, several decades since Japanese and European teens started text messaging, but many other parts of the world, these technologies were not ubiquitous. So it was the phase more of certain specific populations who were using the technology versus now when it's really pretty ubiquitous across ages and geographies. So yeah, the impact is much greater, and I think the ways in which industry and politics and everything is now channeled through our mobile devices. That was definitely not the case back then. It was much more about interpersonal communication. It wasn't about commerce. I mean, there was some of it, but it was mostly about people keeping in touch with other people who they knew. The introduction of, rich, high bandwidth media, like the mobile phone as our primary media device, the mobile phone as a device for commerce, for, political organizing. I mean, that came much later. So it was a very, very different landscape. Now, for the populations that were engaged with it at the time, it was revolutionary, though. Yeah. I think there's a few components as to why, Japanese teens specifically were the early adopters and innovators in the mobile communication space. I mean, one is the technology. So there was, the innovation that was happening on the mobile communication provider side, where they were paying attention to what young people were doing and creating innovative products around that. So that was an important part of the ecosystem. The second is the urban environment in cities like Tokyo, where young people are spending a lot of time in crowded public spaces and public transportation, other spaces where you can use text messaging to have private communications. You're not going to want to use voice. And so there's sort of features of the urban environment. There's a lot of in-between time that is highly conducive to mobile communication. So there's some structural features like teenagers in countries where they might be driving or they might not be spending a lot of time in crowded settings might have a different set of motivations. And then the third is some of the unique sociocultural constraints of teenage life, which is that teenagers in, post-industrial contexts like Japan are in a unique life stage where they are highly motivated to be connected with their peers and romantic partners, but they have very little opportunity to talk to them in private. So teens' lives, they shuttle between the home where they can't hang out with their friends. And that's another structural feature in Japan. It's not common for teenagers to go to each other's homes because they're smaller and, there's a sense of privacy there that is maybe somewhat unique. So they're either home where they can't really hang out with their friends, or they're at school where they're with their friends, but there's no space for private communication. And then there's all that space in between where they're commuting and on a bus and things like that, where they can hang out with their friends. But again, they're often in separate spaces, or it's noisy, it's not private. And so all of those features mean that you have a population that is uniquely motivated to try to find ways to stay in touch with their peers and to have private communication. And a lot of people kind of want to believe that somehow teens are somehow more social or more peer-oriented than other age groups. And there is some aspect to it because it is an age where you're trying to develop your identity independent of your family. But I think the biggest feature that I saw motivating mobile adoption was the fact that teens, relative to their kind of adult level intelligence, agency, social autonomy, are limited and oppressed in their ability to control their private spaces. I think there's a few things that are on the horizon or probably have already hit the field. Again, I'm not as central to the field, so I don't have my pulse on what people are working on as much. But in my area where I'm still focused on young people and the way that conversations around mobile phones have been happening. One is the big debate around mental health and well-being and the use of mobile phones. And that's obviously a big topic, and one that I hope the field of, technology and communication studies will really help grapple with, because there's so much public attention that is not evidence-driven, that really doesn't have the interests of young people at heart, that isn't, doing careful empirical studies, but it's just being driven by this very well-established narrative of grown-ups worrying about young people, having sort of concerns about their use of technology and then rushing to solutions which are about limiting their agency and autonomy. And my hope is that the mobile communications field will really grapple with that in a productive way that honors not only the agency and innovation of youth, but also the diversity of their experiences, which is what, our social and cultural fields and technology studies fields do so well. And then the other obvious one is AI, and what are the impacts, and how do we rethink what mobile is in an era when AI is being embedded in a lot of different devices. It'll be, appearing not only in the kind of Alexa type devices, but in toys and, objects in our environment. And, back in the day, there was terms like ubiquitous computing and, computing embedded in environments, which I think has never quite melded exactly with mobile communication studies as a field. But I think now that AI is going to be embedded in our cars and just things that we're talking to in our everyday environment, I think there is this importance of attending to how this kind of smart environments are layering with our devices in ways that are, not just about a mobile device, but about that the mobile device is kind of an interface to much more kind of AI activated, ubiquitous digital environment that we're navigating. And I'm sure that every field is grappling with the implications of AI right now, but it seems especially relevant for the mobile communications field, which has studied people's intimate relationship with technology for so long. And the field is very unique because the kind of relationship we have with our devices has always been different from the personal computer or, as a way of interfacing with the digital world. And so I think the field is uniquely equipped to help us understand both the dynamics around health and well-being, but also the impacts of AI. I mean, I would love it if, there was this continued really spirit of kind of openness and innovation. Again, I haven't been involved in the field as it's become bigger and more professionalized, but I think for people who are attracted to new technology and new trends, I think the exciting part about it is that there's a space and opportunity to do things differently and have different theoretical and conceptual frameworks. And with the new technologies of the day, it really demands it. So we do want specialists and we want discipline and we want, theory that is robust and, multi-generational, but we also need to have an openness to bringing together people to think in actually quite new and innovative ways in terms of theory and methods. So I hope that the field will continue to do that. And then the other piece, which I think the mobile communication field has always been good at, is having an international perspective. So part of the impetus for innovation that we experienced in the early years, and I think the field continues to benefit from, is really being open and welcoming to international perspectives and what different cultural contexts teach us about the variability in human innovation and experience and ways that we can do things and think about things differently.